The title of this story is, My Brother Had an Affair with My Fiancée for 6 months. My family expected me to forgive them, so I disappeared and built a life they'll never be part of. Now they suddenly want me back. Hey, everyone. Banana here. Today's video is a single, complete story. It starts with the original post and is followed by 3 updates, so you'll get the entire journey from beginning to end. Nothing is left unanswered. Every loose end gets tied up. If you'd rather jump around, you'll find timestamps below the video that let you skip to any section you want. Before we get started, I want to say one thing. This is one of those stories where a guy spends his entire life putting everyone else first, only to get betrayed by the people he trusted most. He gives and gives until there's nothing left. The turning point comes when he finally decides he's done sacrificing himself. What he creates after walking away is the reason this story sticks with people. If you enjoy stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Now let's get into it. I'm a 28-year-old man, and honestly, I still don't know how to put everything that happened into words. My fiancée, Vanessa, is 27, and we've been together for 4 years. We've been engaged for the last 8 months, and our wedding was only 3 months away when my entire world collapsed. The invitations had already gone out. We'd secured the venue months earlier, and our honeymoon was fully booked. Her wedding dress was hanging in our closet, waiting for the big day. I'd even written my vows and kept them saved on my phone. I'd catch myself practicing them in the shower like some love-struck idiot. I truly believed she was the woman I was going to build the rest of my life with. Then there's my younger brother, Brandon, who's 26. Our dad walked out on us when we were kids, so I ended up taking on responsibilities no child should ever have. I practically helped raise Brandon myself. Looking back, I carried far more than someone my age should have. But when you're the oldest sibling and your family depends on you, you don't really think twice about it. Mom worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. By the time I was 15, I was doing grocery shopping for the family. I made sure Brandon always had clean clothes to wear to school, and I helped him finish his homework, even when I still had my own assignments waiting for me. I became a second parent long before I was even old enough to get behind the wheel of a car. Brandon eventually got comfortable with that arrangement. He grew up knowing there would always be someone ready to step in and rescue him whenever life got hard. When Mom couldn't afford to send him to college, I covered every penny myself. I never treated it like a loan or expected the money back. I simply paid the tuition. 3 semesters later, he dropped out. Nobody mentioned the money I'd spent. I didn't bring it up either. That was just who I was. I swallowed the disappointment and kept moving forward. Last year, after he lost his job, I let him stay in my house for 6 months without paying a dime in rent. I bought groceries so he'd have food in the fridge. I drove him to interviews whenever he had one scheduled. I even paid his phone bill until he found steady work again. On top of all that, I rewrote his resume because the version he'd made looked like he'd thrown it together on his phone in about 5 minutes. To be fair, he probably had. When he finally got hired somewhere, I was the first person he called with the good news. And I was honestly proud of him. That's how much I believed in him. I even asked him to be my best man at my wedding. That's how completely I trusted my little brother. Then, a few weeks ago, everything changed. A meeting at work got canceled unexpectedly, so I decided to head home early. I figured I'd surprise Vanessa with flowers on the way. I stopped at the grocery store and picked up a bouquet of sunflowers because they were always her favorite. I was feeling good that afternoon. The radio was playing. The windows were down. I kept thinking about how close we were to getting married. Only 3 months left. When I got home, I walked inside like I always did and dropped my keys onto the kitchen counter. Then I heard some noise coming from the bedroom, so I walked toward it. That's when I found Brandon and Vanessa together in my bed. My own bedroom, my own house, my own brother. The flowers slipped right out of my hands and hit the floor. The second they saw me, they both started scrambling around in a panic, like cockroaches scattering when someone flips on the lights. I knew right then this wasn't some one-time mistake. People don't react that smoothly after a single bad decision. They'd done this before. Vanessa opened her mouth like she wanted to explain. I simply raised my hand to stop her. I didn't say a single word. I turned around, walked straight out the front door, got into my car, and drove away. I had no destination. I didn't care where I ended up. I just kept driving until my thoughts became a complete blur. Eventually, I pulled into some random parking lot and sat there while everything I'd built over the last 4 years crumbled inside my head. I remember gripping the steering wheel and staring at my hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't even anger. It was pure shock. My body understood what had happened long before my mind could process it. For years together, every plan I'd made, every dream I'd built, gone the moment I opened that bedroom door. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about those sunflowers lying on the bedroom floor, still wrapped in plastic, just sitting there on the carpet while my entire future disappeared. Less than an hour later, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Vanessa kept calling. Brandon kept calling. Mom kept calling too. It felt like they were taking turns trying to reach me. I switched my phone to silent and watched the notifications pile up without answering a single one. It almost felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Eventually, I checked into the cheapest motel I could find near the highway. It was one of those rundown places where the hallway ice machine had probably been broken for years, and the carpet looked like it hadn't been replaced since sometime in the 1990s. I sat on a bed that smelled like industrial cleaning products and stared at the wall for hours. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. All I could do was replay every conversation Vanessa and I had shared over the previous 6 months, desperately searching for the signs I'd somehow missed. There was a water stain on the ceiling that looked strangely like a boot. I stared at it so long that I can still picture it perfectly whenever I close my eyes. Several times I picked up my phone because I wanted to call somebody. Every single time, I realized there wasn't anyone left to call. The people I would normally lean on were the very people who had destroyed my life. Then Mom sent me a text. It read, "Ethan, please come home. We need to talk about this as a family." As a family. Those words hit me harder than I expected. My brother had just blown up my entire future, and somehow we were supposed to sit down and discuss it like it was a misunderstanding. 2 days later, Mom begged me to come over for a family meeting. Against my better judgment, I agreed. At that point, I still believed family actually meant something. I honestly thought blood still mattered. When I walked into Mom's house, everyone was already waiting. Mom, Brandon, Vanessa, my Aunt Patricia, my Uncle Stephen, my older sister Natalie. They were all sitting together in the living room, almost like they gathered for an intervention. Except the intervention wasn't for the people who betrayed me. It was for me, the man who'd been cheated on. There was even a plate of cookies sitting on the coffee table. Cookies. I remember staring at them, wondering if my mom had seriously baked snacks for this conversation. She spoke to me in that soft, calming voice people use when they've already decided you're the unreasonable one. She asked me to sit down. I stayed exactly where I was. The first thing I asked was why Vanessa was even there. Mom calmly answered that everyone needed to handle the situation like adults. I told her there was nothing left to discuss. I'd caught them together in my own bed. That wasn't something you debated. That was the final verdict. Brandon immediately started apologizing. His eyes were red, and he kept insisting that he never meant for any of this to happen. He was sitting in Dad's old brown chair, the one tucked away in the corner that nobody ever used anymore. He leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees, rubbing his hands together exactly the way he'd done since we were kids, whenever he got nervous. I finally asked the one question that mattered. How long? Vanessa avoided looking at me. She stared at the floor instead. Then she quietly said it wasn't that simple. I asked the question again. How long? This time I got an answer. 6 months. 6 months. Half a year. For 6 straight months, I worked overtime so I could afford the honeymoon Vanessa said she wanted. Every morning, I made her coffee before work. Every lunch break, I sent her a text telling her I loved her like the devoted fool I was. While I was pouring everything I had into building a future with her, she was busy tearing it apart behind my back. I spent hours at work looking through venue photos, organizing reception playlists, and figuring out seating arrangements. Meanwhile, she lied to my face every single day for half a year. Every morning she'd kiss me goodbye before I left for work. Now all I can think is, what happened after I backed out of the driveway? Every evening I'd come home exhausted, and she'd ask how my day had gone. I'd tell her everything. She'd smile. She'd nod. All while carrying around a secret big enough to destroy my life. The worst part is that I never questioned any of it. Why would I? These were the 2 people I trusted more than anyone else in the world. Sometimes I go back through the timeline in my head, and it honestly makes me feel sick. 6 months means the affair started while Brandon was still living under my roof. While I was paying for his groceries. While I was covering his car insurance. While I was driving him to job interviews because he didn't have a steady paycheck. I was literally financing his entire life while he was sleeping with my fiancée just a few rooms away. Every dinner the 3 of us shared around that kitchen table. They both knew exactly what they were doing. I was the only one completely in the dark. Then Vanessa looked at me with tears in her eyes and actually said they were in love. She claimed they'd tried to resist it, but you can't choose who you fall for. As if that somehow made any of this acceptable. Before I could even answer, my Aunt Patricia jumped in and told me not to be so crude. My aunt. She was worried about my tone. Then she added that this situation was difficult for everyone involved. Mom reached over and gently rested her hand on my arm. Brandon is your brother, she said. Family forgives. Then she actually followed that up by saying maybe it was better that all of this happened before the wedding. Like she was somehow doing me a favor by pointing it out. My older sister Natalie chimed in next. She said I was overreacting. According to her, both Brandon and Vanessa felt terrible and had never wanted to hurt me. Didn't want to hurt me? They carried on an affair for 6 months and simply hoped I'd never discover it. That wasn't avoiding pain. That was hiding it. Then my mom suddenly snapped at me because she didn't like the language I was using. Not Brandon. Not Vanessa. Me. Apparently, I was the problem because of the words coming out of my mouth. The betrayal wasn't the issue. The months of lies weren't the issue. My choice of words was. That's when something inside me completely settled. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't yelling. Everything just became quiet. I looked around the room and slowly said, let me make sure I've got this right. My brother sleeps with my fiancée for 6 months. In my own house. In my own bed. And somehow I'm the one who's supposed to calm down? Mom looked right at me and quietly repeated, he's your brother. I looked back at her and answered, not anymore. The room instantly fell silent. Nobody spoke. I turned toward Brandon. You're dead to me. Then I faced Vanessa. You can keep the engagement ring. Think of it as compensation for the 4 years you stole from me. Finally, I looked at my mother. You picked him. I hope you're happy with that decision. Because choices come with consequences. Don't call me. Don't text me. And don't ever show up at my door. We're finished. Then I walked out. Nobody came after me. Nobody even tried. Not one person stopped me. They all stayed exactly where they were. I got into my car, but didn't leave right away. I just sat there in the driveway for several minutes. Through the front window, I could still see everyone inside. Then Mom finally stood up. She walked over to Brandon and wrapped her arms around him. Around him. I sat there watching my own mother comfort the son who had destroyed my future. That's the final memory I have of my family. Mom holding Brandon while I sat alone outside. They made their decision. So I made mine. I'll post another update if anything else happens. Looking back at it now, it's almost unbelievable. Ethan walked into that house hoping his family would support him after discovering his brother had slept with his fiancée for 6 months. Instead, they treated him like he was the one causing problems. His aunt criticized his language. His mom corrected his attitude. His sister accused him of being dramatic. Not one person in that room truly condemned what Brandon had done. And despite all of that, Ethan never screamed. He never begged anyone to take his side. He simply accepted the truth. He finally understood exactly where he stood in that family. Now let's move on to the first update. Update 1. A couple of days later, I went back to the house. Vanessa had already cleared out everything she owned. Some of my things were missing too. She hadn't wasted any time. It honestly felt like she'd prepared for this long before I found out. Leave me. Move in with Brandon. Tell everyone they simply fell in love so she wouldn't look like the bad guy. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like she'd planned every step. I was the only person who didn't know the script. That same night, I called a real estate agent and listed the house for sale. There was no way I could keep living there. Every time I looked at the bedroom, I pictured what I'd walked in on. Every room carried a memory. Sometimes it reminded me of Vanessa. Sometimes Brandon. Usually both. Her shampoo was still sitting in the shower. The refrigerator still had a souvenir magnet from one of our vacations together. On the hallway mirror, there was a sticky note she'd written a couple of months earlier. It simply said, I love you. Have a great day. I'd walked past it every day without thinking. That night I peeled it off. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I tossed it straight into the trash. I just needed to get out. The following morning, I called my boss about a transfer we'd discussed months before. It was in another state. Back then, Vanessa had begged me not to accept it because she said it would take us too far away from our families. Funny how quickly things change. My boss told me the position was still available. I could start in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That was all the time I had to dismantle an entire life. Since I didn't even own enough moving boxes, I packed almost everything into large black garbage bags. I stuffed clothes, books, and whatever else I owned into them before loading everything into my car. While I packed, my phone never stopped ringing. Mom, Natalie, Aunt Patricia, over and over again. Every call sounded exactly the same. Forgive them. Be the bigger person. Family is family. What I never heard was the one thing that actually mattered. I'm sorry. Not once. My aunt even left me a voicemail saying I was the one tearing the family apart. Me. Apparently I was responsible. Not Brandon. Not Vanessa. Me. Because I refused to pretend none of it had happened. After that, I blocked every single one of them. 3 days before I was scheduled to leave, Brandon came to my house. He pounded on the front door while shouting my name. He apologized again and again, as if repeating the same words enough times would somehow erase what he'd done. I never answered. Instead, I watched him through the front window. He was standing on the porch I'd rebuilt with my own hands the previous summer. Ironically, he'd helped me stain it. Back then, everything still felt normal. We'd ordered pizza that afternoon. We sat outside in old clothes, eating straight from the box while the stain dried on the railings. He'd been practicing the speech he planned to give as my best man. He kept messing up the exact same sentence. and we laughed until our stomachs hurt. It was one of those ordinary memories you never realize will become priceless until it's gone forever. Now that same porch had become the place where he stood begging me to let him inside. I never opened the door. I simply waited until he ran out of things to say. Eventually, he sat down on the front steps with his head buried in his hands. He stayed there for several minutes. Then he stood up, walked away, and disappeared. I closed the blinds. Then I went back to packing. On the morning I left, I loaded the last garbage bag into my car. The house was almost completely empty except for the furniture I'd sold along with it. Before leaving, I stood alone in the kitchen for a minute. That was where I'd proposed to Vanessa, right beside the counter. I'd spent hours cooking dinner that night. I completely ruined the chicken. In the end, I secretly ordered food from a nearby restaurant, transferred it onto my own plates, and pretended I'd made it. She knew exactly what I'd done. She laughed. Then she said yes. That memory used to make me smile. Now it only reminded me how blind I'd been. I took one final look around the house, locked the front door, left the key under the welcome mat for the real estate agent, got into my car, started driving. I never looked back. The man who had lived in that house no longer existed. My first night in the new city was about as simple as it could get. I didn't own any furniture yet, so I sat on the bare floor of my apartment with nothing but a sleeping bag, one suitcase, and a container of cold teriyaki takeout from a little place down the street. I grabbed it because I didn't know where anything else was yet. The apartment was completely empty. Every word I spoke echoed off the walls. The refrigerator made this strange humming noise that seemed incredibly loud in all that silence. As weird as it sounds, that constant hum almost felt like company. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the lights outside. That was the first moment I realized what life felt like when nobody expected anything from me. It was just quiet, real, honest silence. No phone buzzing every 20 minutes. Nobody asking for help. Nobody calling because they needed me to fix another problem. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. It felt strange, but it also felt peaceful. The weeks slowly turned into months. I threw myself into work. I learned the city, found my favorite coffee shop, discovered a couple of restaurants I kept going back to. Little by little, the place stopped feeling temporary. It finally started feeling like home. Eventually, I decided it might be time to start dating again. Nothing serious at first. I definitely wasn't ready for that. Still, it felt nice just spending time with someone who wasn't lying to my face. Honestly, the bar wasn't exactly set very high anymore. I went on several dates that never led anywhere. One woman spent almost the entire evening talking about her ex-boyfriend. I think she talked about him for 45 straight minutes. Another barely looked up from her phone through dinner. If I'm being honest, I wasn't giving it my full effort either. I was mostly trying to prove to myself that I could move forward. Then I met Claire. She taught 4th grade. She had this contagious laugh that made everyone nearby smile whether they meant to or not. We met at a cookout hosted by one of my coworkers. She was wearing this oversized sun hat that kept sliding down into her face. I made some dumb joke about how enormous it was. Without missing a beat, she smiled and said, "This hat has survived 4 different countries. It's never let me down." Right then I thought, yeah, I like her. Everything between us felt easy. There were no games. No guessing. No pretending to be somebody else. Our first date was at a tiny Vietnamese restaurant. The funny part was that neither of us could read a single word on the menu. So we laughed, pointed at random items, and agreed we'd eat whatever arrived at the table. Some dishes were incredible. One of them, honestly, I still have no clue what it actually was. Claire took one bite, smiled, and simply said, "Adventure." That pretty much summed her up. About 6 months into our relationship, she asked me about my family. I told her everything. Every last detail. She stared at me like I'd just told her the sky was purple. "So let me get this straight," she said. "Your family chose your brother and the woman he cheated with over you?" "Pretty much. And somehow they expect you to apologize?" I shrugged. "I guess they think I'm the dramatic one." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Ethan," she said softly, "that's not what a family does. Those are people who got used to taking advantage of you. You made the right decision by leaving." Nobody had ever said it that clearly before. Hearing someone else put it into words changed something inside me. For the first time since my life fell apart, I genuinely believed I'd made the right choice. The messages from my old life didn't completely stop. They just became less frequent. Every few weeks, another one would appear. Sometimes from an unfamiliar number. Sometimes from an old family friend. Sometimes from a relative I'd barely spoken to in years. People who suddenly felt qualified to tell me how I should feel. Every message sounded almost identical. "Your family misses you. Haven't you punished them enough? Life's too short. You only get one family." One cousin I barely even knew sent me a 3-paragraph lecture about forgiveness. It sounded like she'd copied every sentence from the inside of a greeting card. What stood out wasn't what those messages said. It was what they never said. Not one person told me what happened to me was wrong. Nobody criticized Brandon. Nobody admitted my family should have defended me. Instead, they all wanted the same thing. They wanted me to make everyone else's lives easier by pretending I wasn't hurt. Then one day a message came from Mom's phone. It said that Brandon and Vanessa had broken up. Apparently, he was struggling and needed his brother. I actually laughed when I read it. They destroyed my life for a relationship that didn't even survive a full year. 6 months of betrayal, and they couldn't even stay together for 12 months afterward. That was the grand love story everyone expected me to understand. They burned everything down for something that didn't even make it through all 4 seasons. I blocked that number 2. Looking back now, it almost makes sense. Brandon and Vanessa's relationship had been built on secrecy, on sneaking around, on the excitement of doing something they weren't supposed to do. Once I disappeared from the picture, there was nothing left to hide. Without that, whatever they thought they had quickly fell apart. Meanwhile, every message from my family continued repeating the same tired lines. Haven't you punished them enough? Not once did anyone simply say, we're sorry. That told me everything I needed to know. They didn't miss me. They missed everything I used to do for them. Now let's move on to Update 2. Update 2. One day I got a message from my Uncle Stephen. The same uncle who had sat quietly through the family meeting without saying a single word. He told me Mom had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer. The doctors had caught it early, and it was treatable, but according to him, she wanted to see me. He admitted that what happened between Brandon and Vanessa had been completely wrong, but he reminded me she was still my mother and said I should at least call her. I must have stared at that message for nearly an hour. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand, reading the same words over and over again. Everything inside me said it was another trap. It felt like they were using Mom's illness to pull me back into the same role I'd always played. The dependable one. The problem solver. The guy everyone leaned on whenever life fell apart. I'd lived through that pattern my entire life. Different emergency. Same solution. Call Ethan. He'll figure it out. But then another thought kept creeping in. She had cancer. No matter how much distance I had put between us, she was still my mom. She was still the woman who worked herself to exhaustion at 2 different jobs just to keep food on our table. She was still the mother who stayed up late helping me fill out college applications even after working all day. That version of her still lived somewhere inside my memories, even if the woman she'd become had broken my heart. Finally, I called Uncle Stephen. The first thing I asked was how serious it really was. He said it was stage 1. She would need surgery first, followed by radiation treatments. The doctors expected a full recovery. Then I asked one more question. Did Mom actually ask you to contact me? There was a long pause. Eventually, he admitted the truth. No, Natalie had asked him to reach out. Of course she had. My sister was still trying to manipulate everything behind the scenes. She was using Mom's diagnosis as bait. I told him to let Mom know I genuinely hoped her treatment went well. But I wasn't coming back. Then I hung up. For the next several days, I felt awful. Not because I thought I'd made the wrong choice, but because walking away from your own mother hurts, even when you know why you had to do it. For almost 3 days I couldn't concentrate on work. Food didn't taste right. It felt like I was carrying a heavy weight on my chest every waking minute. One evening Claire found me sitting on the couch. A baseball game was playing on television, but neither of us had been paying attention to it. Without warning, everything I'd been holding inside finally broke loose. I cried harder than I had since the day I left home. More than a year of anger, grief, guilt, and disappointment poured out all at once. Claire never interrupted me. She didn't try to fix it. She simply wrapped her arms around me and stayed there until I got through it. Mom's treatment ended up going well. I didn't hear it directly from my family. I found out because Natalie kept posting updates online. Hospital photos. Messages about how the family was coming together during a difficult time. There wasn't a single mention of the son who wasn't there. I wasn't surprised. About 18 months after I'd moved away, Vanessa sent me an email. It was long, thoughtful, the kind of apology that looked like someone had rewritten it over and over before finally pressing send. She told me she and Brandon had broken up months earlier. She called the affair the biggest mistake of her life. She admitted she'd thrown away the best relationship she'd ever had for someone who could never truly commit to anything. According to her, Brandon eventually became exactly the person I'd always warned her he was. Unreliable, immature, someone who never followed through. She claimed the affair had started because she'd been lonely. Brandon happened to be around, and she'd made the worst decision she'd ever make. She insisted she wasn't asking for another chance. She only wanted me to know she finally understood what she'd lost. She hoped I was happy. She hoped I was doing well. I read the email twice. Then I sat quietly for about 10 minutes. After that, I deleted it, blocked her email address, and never thought about responding. That apology wasn't really for me. It was for her. She wanted to believe she'd done the right thing by saying she was sorry. She wanted peace for herself. What really stood out was her complaint about Brandon being unreliable. She didn't discover that while she spent 6 months sneaking around with him in my guest room. Apparently, it took another year and a half before she noticed. She could look somewhere else for closure. She wasn't going to find it from me. 2 years after moving away, I asked Claire to marry me. I took her back to a scenic overlook we'd visited early in our relationship. It was the same place we'd gone on our third date. I remembered something she'd said that afternoon. She'd looked out over the view and smiled. This makes everything else feel so small. For 3 weeks I'd been carrying the engagement ring in my jacket pocket, waiting for the perfect moment. There was actually one time I almost proposed at a gas station. She was standing outside laughing at something she'd seen on her phone. The sunlight hit her face just right, and I remember thinking, this is the woman I want forever. But I waited. I wanted the moment to be special. On the day I finally proposed, I was so nervous I almost tripped while we were hiking up the trail. Claire laughed and asked if I was okay. I told her I was just watching my footing. Technically, that wasn't a lie. When we reached the overlook, she stopped to admire the view. I walked over. Didn't give some long speech. Didn't rehearse anything. I simply looked at her and said, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Before I even finished asking the question, she grabbed my face with both hands. Yes, she laughed. Of course yes. Are you seriously asking me? We stood there hugging each other while a random hiker walked past and gave us a thumbs up. Neither of us cared. We could have been standing in the middle of a parking lot, and it would have felt exactly the same. I noticed my hands were shaking, just like they had the night I discovered Vanessa and Brandon. Only this time it wasn't because my world was ending. It was because a new one was beginning. 6 months later, Claire and I got married. We kept it small. Only the people who truly mattered were there. Real friends. Her family. The people who had welcomed me from the very beginning. Her parents. Her sisters. Even her grandmother, who always called me the good one. She'd never met anyone from my old life. She simply decided I was family. That was enough for her. It rained that morning, but the clouds cleared right before the ceremony. Claire smiled at me and said, see, even the weather's rooting for us. Her sister rolled her eyes, even though tears were running down her face while she smiled. After the ceremony, Claire's father walked over, shook my hand, and said something I'll never forget. Welcome to the family, son. I actually had to look away for a second. I'd only known that man for 18 months. Yet those 5 words meant more to me than almost 30 years of hearing nothing from my own family. Nobody from my old life received an invitation. As far as I know, none of them even realized I'd gotten married. 3 years have passed now. I've been promoted twice at work. Claire and I bought a small 3-bedroom house with a yard that still needs plenty of work. Our first weekend there was spent pulling weeds. For some reason, the previous owner had buried little garden gnomes throughout the flower beds. We found 4 of them. Claire lined them up across the porch and immediately gave each one its own name. That's exactly the kind of woman she is. Then our daughter arrived. Her name is Lily. She inherited Claire's laugh. She definitely got my stubborn streak. Without question, she's the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. She recently started walking, which means every day she discovers something new she shouldn't be getting into. Just last week, she emptied every single book from the bottom shelf of our bookcase. Then she sat right in the middle of the pile, looking unbelievably proud of herself. Claire snapped a picture before cleaning up. Looking around now, my life actually feels full. Not the fake kind of full where everyone constantly depends on you. Real full. The kind that's built on love instead of obligation. Vanessa didn't apologize after betraying me. She apologized after her gamble failed. Only after Brandon disappointed her. That isn't genuine remorse. That's simply regretting the choice she made. And those 5 words from Claire's father. Welcome to the family, son. A man I'd known for only 18 months made me feel more accepted than my own relatives ever had. That says everything. Now let's move on to the final update. Final update. One afternoon my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Normally I ignore calls like that. I'd learned my lesson after one of my cousins once borrowed a coworker's phone just to get around being blocked. But for some reason, I answered this one. It was Natalie. She told me she'd been trying to reach me for months. Then she got straight to the point. We need to talk about Brandon. I answered without hesitation. I don't have a brother. She ignored that. Instead, she explained that Brandon had been admitted to a treatment facility. Ever since I'd left, his life had steadily fallen apart. He'd lost his job, started getting involved with the wrong crowd, cut himself off from almost everyone. Then, the month before, he tried to hurt himself. I'm not going to pretend hearing that didn't affect me. I slowly sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the countertop for a long time. No matter what he'd done, part of me still remembered the little boy I used to pick up after school. The kid I taught to ride a bike in our driveway while Mom watched from the front porch. The little brother who used to fall asleep with his head resting on my shoulder. I couldn't help remembering the little kid who used to fall asleep on my shoulder while we watched movies together on the couch. Back then, he was so small I'd carry him to bed without waking him up. Those memories are still real. But the version of Brandon from those days is gone. The man he became made choices that destroyed not only our relationship, but the brother I used to know. I finally asked Natalie the question that mattered most. Is he alive? She said yes. She explained that he was getting treatment and slowly improving. Then she told me he kept asking for me. According to her, he believed he couldn't move on with his life until he somehow made things right between us. Then she started pleading. She admitted everyone had handled everything terribly. She admitted Brandon had done something unforgivable. But then she fell back on the same old argument. He's your brother. He needs you. I took a deep breath before answering. He stopped being my brother the day he chose to betray me. Natalie immediately tried another angle. He was young. He was stupid. I couldn't believe she was still making excuses. He was 26 years old, I said. I was 28. We weren't kids. We were two grown men making adult decisions. And every single person in this family chose his side. Every one of you. Then I finally said something I'd been carrying around for the last 3 years. This isn't really about Brandon, is it? It's about all of you realizing you backed the wrong person. And now you're stuck living with that decision. I hung up before she could answer. When I turned around, Claire was sitting across the room. Lily had fallen asleep in her arms. She had one tiny fist wrapped around the collar of Claire's shirt, the way she always did whenever she was drifting off. Claire looked up and quietly asked what had happened. So I told her everything. Without saying a word, she shifted Lily into one arm and wrapped the other around me. About a month later, I received an email from Mom. It was the longest message she'd ever sent me. Honestly, it probably took her hours to write. She admitted she hadn't treated me fairly. She admitted choosing Brandon over me had been the biggest mistake she'd ever made. She said that whenever she thought about that family meeting, she wished she had stood up and told Brandon exactly how wrong he was instead of asking me to forgive him. According to her, she replayed that day in her mind constantly. And every time she did, she hated herself a little more. She confessed something I'd suspected for years. She sided with Brandon because he was always the child who needed more help. She admitted that wasn't an excuse. She simply wanted me to know she was sorry. She told me she wasn't asking me to come back. She only wanted me to know she understood that she'd failed me. At the very end, she said she hoped one day she'd get the chance to meet her granddaughter. That email stayed with me for days. I'd be lying if I said it didn't affect me. Part of me had spent 3 years waiting to hear exactly those words. A piece of me wanted to call her immediately, pretend none of it had happened, go back to family dinners, holiday gatherings, being her son again. But another part of me, the part that had spent years rebuilding my entire life from the ground up, knew there was no going back. It wouldn't be returning home. It would be undoing everything I'd fought to build. And I hadn't come this far just to start walking backward. I showed the email to Claire. She read every word. Then she sat quietly for a while before looking at me. I think she's 3 years too late, she finally said. But this decision belongs to you. I didn't answer right away. For an entire week I kept thinking about it. I reread Mom's email at least 10 different times. Sometimes I'd open it during my lunch break at work. I'd read it. Then I'd lock my phone again without replying. Finally, one evening after Lily had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and wrote back. I thanked her for apologizing. I told her I appreciated hearing those words. But I also told her the apology couldn't erase what had happened. She chose Brandon. She made me question my own feelings. She allowed everyone else in the family to do the same. Then I told her something that mattered even more. I have a family now. A real one. I said I genuinely hoped Brandon recovered. I hoped her health continued improving. But I wasn't coming back. A short time later she replied, I understand. I love you. I never answered. Last week another message appeared. This time it came from Brandon. He told me he'd been sober for 6 months. He said recovery had forced him to confront everything he'd done. He admitted there was no excuse for what happened. Then he wrote something I'd never expected to read. He said he destroyed my life because he had been selfish. Weak. He admitted he'd taken advantage of my kindness. Thrown it away for someone who ultimately meant nothing. He told me I had been the best brother anyone could ask for. And he'd repaid me by sleeping with my fiancée. Inside my own house. While I was busy planning my wedding. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even expecting a reply. He simply needed me to know that he finally understood exactly what he'd done. I read the message. Then I read it again. After that, I walked out to the garage and sat there with the door open for a long time. Inside the house I could hear Lily laughing. Claire was making dinner. The smell drifted all the way out into the garage. Eventually I went back inside and handed Claire my phone. She stood at the kitchen counter with a dish towel over her shoulder while she read every word. When she finished, she looked at me. Are you going to answer him? I honestly considered it. Brandon sounded sincere. From everything he'd written, it seemed like he'd truly done the hard work of facing himself. Part of me wanted to believe people could change. Part of me wondered if my little brother still existed somewhere underneath all the damage. Then the memories started coming back. That family meeting. Watching Brandon cry while everyone rushed to comfort him. Nobody even looking at me. Seeing Mom wrap her arms around him after I walked out. Opening my bedroom door that afternoon. 6 months of betrayal. Then my thoughts shifted. I heard Lily laughing again. I felt Claire's hand slip into mine. I pictured the 4 ridiculous garden gnomes lined up across our porch. The little house we'd built together. The woman who loved me simply because she chose to. Not because I earned it. Not because I solved everyone's problems. Just because she loved me. That was enough. I deleted Brandon's message. Without saying anything, Claire leaned over and kissed my forehead. I'm proud of you, she whispered. A second later, Lily came running into the room. Daddy, come play with me. I picked her up. She laughed. Claire smiled. And that was the end of the conversation. Yesterday, someone tagged me in a Facebook photo. It was Natalie. The picture showed Mom, Natalie, Brandon, a few cousins. They were all smiling together at what looked like a backyard barbecue. Brandon looked thinner than I remembered. The caption caught my attention. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose to show up. I quietly removed the tag. Blocked Natalie. Locked my phone. Then I walked outside. Claire was sitting on the porch with Lily on her lap, pointing at a bird hopping around the yard. I joined them, and I went right back to the life I'd built. Every now and then I still think about that old porch. The weekend Brandon and I stained it together. Ordering pizza afterward. Talking about the wedding. Listening to him practice his best man speech over and over. Stumbling on the exact same line until we both laughed so hard we couldn't breathe. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers that day too. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. Either way, I've reached the point where I no longer need to know. And that's where my story ends. 3 years after losing everything, I found something better. I have an incredible wife. A beautiful daughter. A home. A career I love. A life I built from nothing after my brother betrayed me. My fiancé walked away, and my entire family convinced themselves I was somehow the problem for being hurt. Looking back now, I finally understand something. Walking away wasn't the end of my life. It was the beginning of the one I was always supposed to have.